Hi there, my name is Pete Malicki. I'm the Festival Director of Short+Sweet Sydney. As part of our free Masterclass program that we offer to all our participants, tonight we're very pleased to be presenting the Honourable Mr. Peter Garrett, Federal Education Minister, former Federal Arts Minister and former frontman of the band Midnight Oil. Enjoy.
My name's Rosemary Ghazi. I am the Masterclass's coordinator. This man needs no introduction. Here to joining us to present the class on industry experiences, and thing that I think we can all learn from, is Federal Minister Peter Garrett.
Look, thanks very much, Rosemary, and I'm sorry that I'm running a little bit late. Fridays tend to get an accumulation of work in my ministerial life. It's a real pleasure to spend a bit of time talking to you about industry experiences from my perspective, and it's a perspective which in some ways is not typical, but in other ways there are commonalities there that I think apply to everybody working in all arenas of the creative arts. Maybe the first thing to say is that I do masterclasses in performance, and so for those of you who are actors or singer actors, I want to spend a little bit of time on that. I do them at NIDA, which is in my electorate, so as part of my job as the member for Kingsford Smith, and occasionally with Year 11 or Year 12 HSC students who are doing creative arts, performance or the like in that area. So I might dispense with that first. It seems to me that one of the things that performers really struggle with is a two-edged sword. Confidence, which is the first component, and capacity, which is the second component. They're not clear that they have the capacity to perform to their maximum, and because of that insecurity, they're a little tentative when they get onto the stage and start to perform. That tentativeness is something which an audience can discern within seconds. They can intuit that tentativeness, because ultimately, at the base, humans have evolved as people and as a species that loves to tell stories, that sings, that dances, that creates. All the other things that we do are good, and we've created some extraordinary things in terms of our longevity, but those experiences lie at the heart of who we are as people. And quite often for a performer, it's an insecurity about capacity, perhaps feeding into other insecurities. For example, if you're just starting out, or if there's no one in the house, or if the house is full, or if something goes wrong, that can impede your performance. Capacity is a function of work. That's a function of discipline and of being extremely confident in your craft, so that you can do it on the head of a pin, wherever you are, under any circumstance and conditions, however physically impaired or emotionally impaired you may feel at that time. And so that's the same thing that all professional musicians go through, and performers and dancers and others. That's practice. It's just practice. And it's the work of practice. We should never forget that before great artists produced their great art, they spent a lot of time in the routine of practice. I don't know whether it's Picasso or Van Gogh, I can't remember which one it is, perhaps it's Monet, but whoever it is, what I do know is that they did 1,000 sketch drawings over an hour every day. I know that Yehudi Menuhin used to practice for 2 hours in the morning or the afternoon, even when he was a great concert master. I know that Dylan, when he gets to write lyrics, writes them and then scratches them out and writes them again, and then scrunches them up and puts them in the bin and comes back and does it again and again and again and again. And you know what? One of the things that I like to say to people is that the difference between someone who can do it reasonably well and someone who does it to the fullest extent of their personality, their capacity, or their talent isn't the talent question. It's the capacity question. Have they got the capacity to make it as good as they can? And essentially just to go, you know what, I'm going to get up earlier in the morning or stay up later at night, or I'm going to come back to that thing again, I'm going to get my head up against that wall and I'm going to get whatever it is I'm trying to produce, I'm trying to deliver, to be as good as it can be. For actors who sing or for actors who speak on the stage, and I'm starting to do that a little bit more now as an example, you have to master the basic physics of replication of sound, of using your lungs and your voice to throw stuff out into the audience. All of that can be learned, and people who go to acting school or who sing figure that out. But what a lot of people miss is that once you've got that, and we quite often see this on Idol or on telly, you're also having to reach people and make a connection with them. And that's the next step. It's almost like the final step in the process. I can do it, I can sing well, or I can modulate my voice, or I can project very strongly, but am I actually reaching that person when I do it? Making the eye contact that I'm now making with each and every one of you. And to be honest, that's one of the big challenges in the industry that I was in. When you've got a big audience in front of you and you can't actually make that physical connection with them, which is actually why, incidentally, I've always enjoyed theatre, and as Rosemary knows, you know, one of my family members has gotten a bit involved here in theatre, and I love the intimacy of it, and I loved it when I was arts minister as well, because you can reach everybody in the room. That's what makes it still such a tangible, visceral, creative experience. So for those of you who act or who sing or who think about it, it's really quite a simple message from me. It is about practice, and so whatever kind of voice you've got, it's the kind of voice that you know how to get the best out of it. Or if you're an actor and you're speaking to lines, learning scripts and the like, it's really knowing it down just like that. And then it's the connecting point. And of course, as an actor, it's also not only about that connection, but it's also about kind of understanding the role. Sometimes you'll see people performing a role and they're convinced that it's the words on the page and how strongly they can express the words on the page that are the role. And of course, actors that really blow us away are people who kind of take those words on the page and turn them into something a little bit different because they've imagined a different person or they've related to a different person, and there you get it. And I can think of quite a few good examples. The final thing I think to say, and this is all pretty obvious, and a lot of what I'll say tonight I think is obvious, but people just forget it, is that when someone comes to see you, or when someone comes to see a production that you're involved in, this may be the first time that they've seen that particular play or piece of work. It may even be the first time that they've come into a theatre or into any environment that you are involved with putting something on. How can you make that the best experience for them? It's not only about what you're doing on the stage or what you're doing with the lighting or how you're working out the sound or what you're doing with the promotion. It's actually thinking about what is it in all of those facets and all of the other facets that makes it the best experience for them. And I have to be really blunt with you, and I know that this will all end up on YouTube and I'll get a few furious emails and texts, but I just don't think sometimes that the creative sector gives enough thought to that. I think they think a lot about what it is they're creating and a lot about how to make that work, but I'm not sure they give as much thought to the audience side of it and what it means for the audience and how you can really do things that make an audience just feel so excited and so up to it when they come in to see what's going on or to listen or to look. In Midnight Oil, one of the things that we really tried to do in our career, and some younger people will know it less than some of the others that are a little closer to me in age, but one of the things that we tried to do was we tried to make sure that every single person involved in what we were doing was treated with the maximum of dignity and given the maximum kind of performance that they could. This is how we thought about it. And our view about this was pretty straightforward. If we are able to do that consistently, anywhere, firstly here in rough clubs and pubs, including just up the road, and then around the country, and then around the world, if we can have that as our modus operandi, then people will come back. And people will tell other people about it. And people will be willing to give us something in return for what we're giving them. And so that meant that we all, with our manager, Gary Morris, who was an important part of what we did, and our road crew and our team, and eventually when we became more successful, it's a big team of people. It wasn't about, have you got the lights set at the right angle, how are we going here with this list of songs, although we think about those things. Is the sound engineer going to make the sound work? It was actually thinking about, is the car park properly lit as people come and bring their cars into the car park? What are we doing for people who are queued up outside before they get inside? Once they get inside, do we know that there's been a briefing to the security people inside the venue that all our fans are to be treated well? No violence, give women every opportunity to enjoy the show as much as men. Are we thinking about what it means not only for the person who manages to get the front, but the person who's right at the back? Have we spent that time in the sound check making sure that not only the PA is struck, so it will do the job of replicating the sound of the band from where the mixer is, same in here in this little theatre, but where the person who was the last one in, because they got stuck in a traffic jam and they're right up the back, they want to be able to hear it well too. And that is a challenge against two things: human nature and a little bit of our Australian ethos of, well, I think we're getting there and we're just about close enough. Because near enough is never good enough, and you can always do more, and you've always got to push yourself and one another respectfully to make sure you get it right. So that meant sound checking and rehearsing, although I'm not a great one for rehearsal, which I'll come to in a second, of performance, but rehearsing everything around the show. So that's every element of it. In a small venue, where you're really struggling against pub conditions, making sure that you've spoken to the person in the pub so there's a few windows open so it's not too hot and sweaty. Now sometimes it was terribly hot, terribly sweaty, and we nearly died, but thinking about that at least. Is there water around the place for people? Are you explaining what you're doing? Do you have to provide some material for people to contextualise what it is you're doing? Are you asking them to pay too much or too little? And then when you come to the show, as soon as you walk onto stage, not wasting a single moment, not letting any of your thinking or your head get diverted to other things. You'll all know this very well because it's what it's like to be a person. I'm running late. It's crowded. I've just got to the show. I've just been driving by myself. Someone's driven really badly around me and sort of tooted at me as they cut in on me. And I'm walking into the place thinking about this person, how frustrated I am and how aggro they were. Get rid of that thought. And then I'm thinking about what happens if, X song which we've rehearsed doesn't go all that well. Get rid of that thought. In other words, keep those monkeys that have got all those negative thoughts and stuff off your back and just think about that moment. Because the moment of performance in creative art, whatever form it is the pure moment. And you need to have all the technical stuff under control and feel confident that it's there. You have to know that you've done everything you can and you've thought about it, but then you've got to do something which is almost counterintuitive. You've then got to stop thinking about it, particularly if you're a performer. You've then got to stop thinking about it and then just completely let yourself go into the performance. And you see this with actors, with dancers, with painters even, who, they know they've got the paints there. They've got the studio lighting sort of how they like it. They've prepared themselves, then they let themselves go. Now they've done a lot of practice, but then they let themselves go and the great work emerges. So that's really I wanted to give that as a way of explaining a way in which I think people rarely think about performance and rarely think about what it is they're doing and what it is they're providing for people. Now they do professionally. I mean, the Opera House obviously thinks about it, and this theatre would, and the Sydney Theatre Company does, and Sydney Dance Company does. I mean, I see high levels of expertise and care, and people are, someone is the box office person who's in charge of that, and someone's in charge of occupational health and safety, and so that's all. I'm not talking about it in that way. What I'm talking about is what embodies a performance. So in those situations, with those kinds of production companies or institutions that have got resources and do things well, then my expectation is that they do it much better. For those who are where you're just starting out, or if I go to a school performance and they've obviously only been able to rehearse 5 or 6 times, it's what can you do better given the amount of time you've had to do what you're doing. So it's not horses for courses. Well, I suppose it is horses for courses, but it's the same principle that applies. Let me give you an example. Why is it that, on balance, we sometimes hear orchestras that play a certain piece of work, let's just say Liszt's or Dvorak or Beethoven or some of the well-known composers? Why is it that some orchestras really are able to play it really well and it moves you, and others, you just sit there and you just hear a bunch of people seesawing through the black notes? You know, what's the difference? They can play equally well, they're equally trained, they're equally remunerated, and they have around them basically roughly the same level of support and, you know, access to rehearsal times and an instrument. So what makes the difference?
They let themselves go.
It's partly that they don't let themselves go. It's partly about the conductor, what the conductors bring out of them, and it's partly about what they've decided to bring to that performance. And I think an orchestra is a very good example because they're not often playing new music, just like actors quite often aren't, you know, acting in new plays. They are here with some of the great stuff you do in Short+Sweet, but you know, if you look at the staples, you're going to see the same work coming through. So what is it? What is it that's really making some absolutely go fantastic and other? Let me give you an example of what, when I was arts master, what I thought one of the great pieces of music I heard played by an orchestra was the Australian Youth Orchestra. And it sounded fantastic. Now, technically, yeah, it might have been a little rough around the edges, but it sounded fantastic because they were giving everything. They'd let themselves, and they were giving everything to that performance. This was it. They were so excited. They just cooked. Which is what I love about hearing young bands, you know. But we've all got to be able to do that, whatever field we're in, but particularly in performance. I'm not sure what the composition here is, so I think we've got writers, producers, people who are interested in theatre, the technical side, the front of house, back of house, directors. All of that. Huh?
Directors.
Directors. Oh, good. Okay, we've got directors here and actors. Yeah. Okay. All right. So let me now go and answer a few of the questions that Rosemary put to me, and I'll just try and work through those very quickly, and then I think it'll be useful for us to have some dialogue. And I'm really happy for us to have a good yarn about that. I made some notes though, and in making those notes, I'll repeat a little bit of this. So this was my first response to the questions that were asked of me. And the reason I wrote them down is because I also have a bit of a view that quite often your first impulse, your first intuitive response to something is pretty good. I think it's quite often pretty good. You know, we sum people up and we sort of look at their faces and think, oh yeah, I think I get something from that person. We hear a piece of music or we read something, and that's the way you first think or you conceptualise or you understand it, you're usually quite on the money. So, the things that I thought about surviving in the industry broadly, and this is across all the fields that we're doing, I've already said one of them, which is to aim to be the best that you can, and if you're directing, aim to bring the best out in people that you can. I'll talk about that in a second. It's not settling for anything that's less than the best. And to be honest, it's not taking excuses for that. So if you're really pushing someone along and then eventually they sort of say, oh yeah, but you know, my dog, you know, passed away last night. You say, look, I'm really sorry about that, but that's actually not, it's not that relevant to me, you know. What I'm really focusing on is this performance, and you know, let's not think about that. I'm sorry. The second thing was put yourself in the audience's shoes. And there's a lot of self-referential, culture-referential work that people are producing, which is good work, and I'm not critical of that work, but it's not in, there's a lot of people who are potentially audiences who don't get that, they don't speak that language, so I think it's useful to think about them. And it's interesting because the great literature, the great theatre, can still speak to them, even though you've got a play that was written in 16-something, and yet someone's writing a play in 2012, and it's sort of going like that. You know, so put yourself in the audience's shoes. I think for many people in the creative world, it's important to know all the aspects of your business. And I can talk about that a bit more later on, but I really think it's important to know all the aspects. It may be that you are an aspiring director, but you need to know. You need to know how a stage is built, how it sounds. You need to know how lights, striking stages, sound in a room, box office. You need to know about copyright and plays, and you need to know a whole heap of other stuff. How are things promoted? How does promotion and marketing work? And all, you don't need to be intimately across it all, but you need to know it. You need to understand it. You need to understand a little bit about how people respond, the interactions between people, human nature. You need to have thought about that. You need to be a jack of all trades and a master of one trade. You know, this is the key. You do need to be a jack of all trades and a master of one trade. I mean, by the way, there are going to be people, and I'm sure there are some sitting in this room, who probably don't need any of this advice. You know? It's either obvious or it's not relevant. And there are going to be people...
still need to hear it.
Huh?
Still need to be reminded.
Well, there we go. And there's going to be someone who walks in here and someone who gets up here tonight who's just going to open their mouth and everyone's just going to go, you know what? That's double thumbs up. I've been there, I heard it. They don't have to be jack of all trades because their mastery is at that level. But for most of us, it's not. And I can assure you that for me, it wasn't. So that's why I'll tell you a little bit about my start in a second. I think you need to network. That's pretty obvious to say, but I think those networks need to be respectful, healthy, constructive networks. And I used to have an expression that I use for people, especially in the business that I was in, where people can become quite well known quite quickly. And so it's not like theatre, which is a harder game in other ways. I used to say, you'll meet people on the way up, and you're going to meet them on the way down. So think about that, because that's really important. Because even though you're on the way down, you're not going to want to stop doing what you're doing. You're not going to stop wanting to write songs and create and produce and work with people. So, you know, think about that. Be good to people. They were the main things that I was going to say, except for one other thing, which is kind of a hard message, but I think it's pretty important for me to say it, seeing as I'm the oldest person in the room and I've also been the Minister for the Arts. You probably also need to have another good skill. Really? You need another good skill, because it may be that you're not going to be able to support yourself by being a director or a writer or an actor easily. In fact, most of those people that I know, including when they've started out, have had to do other things. So there, it's, you know, some of that is, you know, you'll meet people who are waiting and who are driving cabs and things like that, but it's probably helpful to have a better skill than that, because then you'll get paid more per hour, so you won't have to work as long. You've got more time to think about doing the things that you really want to do. Just very quickly on the startups and what Rosemary's asked me about. I think the thing that I take from my start, and I've said this before publicly, but I wasn't considered a good singer, technically a good singer. We weren't considered to be a likely prospect as a band. And the attitude that we took to writing about politics or wanting to control the venues was considered to be a bit irrelevant and a bit out there. So we had a lot of people telling us that we weren't going to succeed and that maybe they'd succeed if I wasn't around, and so on and so forth. And all that really taught me was that, well, firstly you've got to try hard and not to listen, you know, not to take that advice necessarily, but also to understand what it was that they weren't seeing or weren't hearing, and then have a go at sort of going back to that directly. I think the other thing that the break-in was about was establishing trust and faith with an audience, and establishing that in such a way that they could keep you going through thick and thin. And really, across the creative arena of theatre, drama, music performance, to a lesser extent, modern music's not quite the same. You've got the oeuvre that can always carry you there, you know. There's just this wonderful body of work, other people's creativity, other people's expression. So you've always got that you can have a go at and see whether you can find a way of re-communicating that to a new audience. And I think that's a very exciting thing to do, and I think it's, you know, it's where you see good work, and where I quite often saw good work when I was Arts Minister. The next question was sustaining a full-time career in the arts. Where did creative input come from for new material? Well, that's an easy question to answer in some ways. I was lucky to be in a band of, gifted songwriters, guys like Jim Agini and Rob Hurst, who are really good writers, and we were interested in creativity. So we were interested in ideas. So we were always, the writers and even others and self and, putting lyric ideas together, you're just putting down ideas as they come. So where do they come from? Observation, imagination, and giving yourself the space to do that. And I think just giving yourself, we've all got our ways of doing it, whether it's a special place we go to, or you've got to turn off the devices, or it happens at a certain time of the day, or you get hit with this idea, then you've got to go with it. And I do say to writers and directors and creators that one of the things, and I know having spoken to other authors and people who've operated and gotten to a reasonable level on that, that's a pretty important thing to remember. You get the idea, don't let it go, but actually get it and work with it. It's like working with a piece of clay. And give yourself the time to work with that idea like it's a piece of clay and really get it into a shape that you think is the best that it can be. Because then when you present it, when you're at the point of presenting it or delivering it, then you've gotten it as good as you can. And then you're in the collaborative process, people are going to add value to it. So our band was a genuine partnership. We didn't always agree on everything, how could you? And we spent more time with one another for nearly 20 years than what we spent with our partners and our wives. So it's challenging to continue to be creative and productive sometimes in that environment. But people would bring value to it. And I think there's a little part about that is to try not to have too much of your ego invested in that bit. So, if you put it out there, well, maybe someone's going to say, actually, I don't think that's a very good song. It's not really working for me. Fair enough. Hurts, but can we make it into a good song? Well, why don't we try a bit of that we were working on? Or let's try a different key. Maybe we've got the tempos wrong. Let's turn it upside down. Well, what's the song about? Does it make any sense? Is it going to mean anything to anybody? Going through all of that creative process. Okay, let's not play electrically for a moment. Let's just play acoustically. Okay, let's not play acoustically. Let's just sing this thing and see whether it works as a piece of music. Oh, you know what? It doesn't sound that good. Okay, let's try something else. You have to do that, and you have to constantly do it as a way of getting the best out of this bit of creativity that you've got in front of you. The next question that you asked me was what it was like at the top, and I was very pleased that you put inverted commas around the top. I think that the creative experience and the business of being a performer or being in the creative industry is sustained and sustains you irrespective of whether you're at the top or not. And certainly it was never our intention to be at the top, and we never did it for the money, and we were very surprised by our success. But I think the answer about being at the top is that it's harder when you have achieved a level of success and you're finally starting to get some remuneration, and then you've got more and more people with more and more expectations about it to continue to push in the directions that you want to. And you hear this, I'll have to speak about my own area because I don't feel qualified to speak about other areas, but you do very much hear this in the passage of bands that are successful. Because very few very successful bands continue to make great records. Very few. For those of us of a much earlier generation, the Beatles only made 6 or 7 albums. And some of Paul McCartney's stuff after that was variable. But I can think of many other examples. I can think of authors and others. That's hard. So that's the hardest thing about it. The best thing about it is that you're not worrying about money as much. At least not in the same way. But I think, and what it was like was it was a tremendous privilege to have people responding to you. And I've been through some amazing performing experiences. I've performed at jails in front of people who've had their hands clasped up against the wire fence, sort of looking at us from 20 feet away, to very positive audiences of 100,000 people in huge fields in Europe or big stadiums around the world. So I've had that great privilege. So and it's a rare thing for someone to experience. But in terms of what it's like, I think the fact is it's just like what you all do. know? So when I walk out on the stage, when I used to, whether it was in front of 1,000 people or 10,000 people, I'm still basically thinking the same things and doing the same things. Let me explain it to you. So here it goes. Okay. In my head, I'm now about to perform to 1,000 people. Each and every one of those people, I want to give them the best that I possibly can. Oh, I'm aching a bit, I had the flu, we drove for 6 hours, forget all that, here we are. Let the adrenaline start, you're about to perform. Quick check on all the technical aspects of what you have to do. In-ear piece, is it set the right way? Of course it is. Have I set myself up properly? Do I know where the lights are? If I figured out what happens backstage, I know what's happening with security, I know where the band is, so all of those technical issues about the performance are ready. It's set at the right level. I've got to remember that I really want to push out there, cut, and then just go for it as hard as you can with everything that you have. Sweat it, push it until it hurts, you know, until you're at the point where there's nothing more that you can give. And then when you get back off that stage, you just lie in the corner and someone might throw you a beer or a bit of water, and at a certain period of our careers, oxygen tanks, we used to have those. Now that experience is the same whether you're in front of 100 people or 1,000 or 10,000, you know? That's really what it should be. Of course the scale is different, and if everybody's enjoying what you're doing, that's beautiful. But the thing itself is no different. So I don't subscribe to the view that people are better or more talented simply because they have a bigger audience or more success at all. I never have subscribed to that view. I think the doing of it is the important thing, how much integrity you've got in what you do. That includes other things like washing up and whatever, not that we wash up anymore. And the same thing applies in front of a big audience, because a big audience has got its own personality and its own power, and quite often performers, and I freely admit that, you know, I've fallen into this as much as any other have, understand that, and so there's a point where you can respond to that. So you can play the song that you know people would like to hear, or do the sorts of things that you know get a certain kind of response. Whilst that's a very important part of thinking about the audience as they come in, being very successful or having a high level of success means that you've also got to guard in some ways against becoming too predictable and doing the same thing all the time because it works in that way. It becomes a little tricky in the head to figure that stuff out. But I think, you know, if you go and see, let me think of a performer who I think really embodies this extremely well, that you will know. It'll come to me in a second. There is one or two out there. But I reckon that's all I can say about the top. Not much more. Here we are. The other side of the industry is Arts Minister. Maybe I should just deal with that really quickly. So I loved being Arts Minister. And I really enjoyed and relished the opportunity. I saw a lot of work, and that was fantastic. And I didn't fall asleep. There was everything just about I saw I enjoyed or I got something out of. I think that there are many exciting things happening in Australia, in our artistic communities, across the range of work, particularly in media arts and online digital creation, particularly in the interface between what we might describe as visual art and also like gaming and architecture and all the incredible things that video art, they're called video artists, but they're really digital artists too. We did some good things. You know, we made sure that visual artists would get a resale royalty right when their work was on sold. So for those of you who understand the royalty system of songwriting royalties or authorship royalties or visual art royalties, visual arts, paintings, previously, once a painting was sold, so let's just assume, what's your name? Uma. Let's assume Uma does a painting, and it's a great painting, and she signs it Uma, and she sells it up here at Newtown in a little gallery, and it sells for $500. But everyone really thinks that Uma's paintings are sensational, and over time her paintings get more and more and more value, and 2 or 3 times later it gets on sold and it's sold for $10,000. But Uma doesn't see none of that at all. No proportions, no nothing. This is especially important for Aboriginal artists because quite a lot of Aboriginal artists would sell their paintings, sometimes painted in the remote parts of the country. The first time they sold it, it might be for $100 or $500 or whatever it might be. And then they became very well established, very highly regarded, and their paintings were selling as much as $40,000 or $50,000 or $100,000. A resale royalty means that every time the painting's resold, the artist, the original artist, gets a very small percentage of that sale. It's a royalty. But of course, on a $10,000 or a $15,000 or $100,000 painting, it's actually quite a bit. If it happens twice, it's a significant income for them. And we introduced that into the Parliament. There's a law that was introduced, passed through the Parliament. There's now a scheme that's set up to do that. I'm proud of that. I thought it was a very important thing for us to do. We put performing artists into schools so that kids could be learning with a practitioner coming in, whether it was an actor or a musician or a dancer or someone like that. Especially for kids in primary school. One of the things about music is that we're not a big singing nation, and we don't sing as much as other cultures do. And in previous times, quite often a teacher might have some existing musical experience. They might have sung in a church choir, or they might play piano or guitar or something like that. Many people don't play those instruments now. So a lot of kids who come into a classroom who want to sing, and for whom singing would be a fantastic thing to be doing, don't have anyone to do it with. So that program is very important. If you look at the budget, I'll just quickly take you through the federal budget before we all fall asleep. A lot of resources in the budget are directed towards making sure that we maintain appropriate levels of support for the film industry, for our existing opera company, for the orchestras. And the budget there is quite significant. For film, I don't know if you noticed in the paper today, I think it's the next Finding Nemo film. Have I got that right? Yeah. There's what's called a location offset that applies to films that are made here in Australia. I'm going to talk about the exchange rate now, and you will go to sleep. But what the government effectively does is it provides an offset or a subsidy for someone to come and make a film here in Australia. There's certain conditions around it. And it gets written off against our budget, our national budget. It's a very good thing, and we brought it in and we adjusted it a bit so to attract more filmmaking here, but also using Australian talent, but not quite the way in which some people think. That's important because of all the spin-offs around the industry, which I'll come to in a second. And then across your orchestras, the Australia Council that some of you will know about, support that's given to AusCo, and it then of course has its different mechanisms for supporting artists as well. So I really enjoyed my time as Arts Minister. Always more to do, and looking at delivering a national cultural statement, which Minister Crean is now having a look at and working up. And always more things that you'd like to support but you don't have the money to do. That's sort of the way of it. What did I get from my period as Arts Minister by way of responding to the work that people were doing? I got a tremendous insight and knowledge in forms that I wasn't that familiar with, and I saw some fantastic work. But I also saw quite a lot of work that I thought could just be, just need a little bit of a push, and it just might sort of get there. And I really, that sense of urgency that I had when I was a performer and a creator, I love it when I see that sense of urgency and real concentration on what's happening reflected in the work that I'm seeing, as opposed to, well, this is how we understand the work should be performed, and we think we've got it up to about the right level, and everything seems to be in its place. Pause, have a cup of tea, chat about what was on telly, bit of gossip, check what's on my handheld device. No. Are we absolutely certain, as a team, as a company, as an individual, that we have gotten ourselves to that maximum point? Almost like an ultra marathon runner, or someone who's you sort of look at them and you think, oh God, I can't bear the thought of you pushing your body any further. But that's what they're doing, because that's where they want to be. They've trained for it, they've got themselves in the zone. Creativity shares something with that. I think there's sweat in creativity. There's also fun, and it's a wonderful thing to be involved in it, but there's also the sweat of it. And I sometimes think that to get to that point where you really can get to with your own abilities, you need to sweat a little bit. The other thing about Arts Ministers, we've got arts happening in different states. Community art, community expression was the thing which for me was particularly important, and which I think can really bring communities alive, and I loved seeing it, and I saw some wonderful stuff. Aboriginal people are doing some of the strongest work in art particularly, but also in writing that I experienced as well, because they've got a very, very important story to tell, and they really want their audiences to understand that story. They really want their audiences to understand. They don't want them to understand it because they read in the review, your review of books, or they jumped online and it was the latest and the greatest thing coming out of Europe. They wanted to tell that story because this is where they've been and this is what's happened, and they want you to know about it. And that's what gives their work the kind of power that we quite often see. Just very quickly and finally, and as an ex-artist, how did that influence my approach as Arts Minister? Well, I understood the industry quite well, and I knew what it took to get somewhere down the road in performance and putting something together and making it work. So I was very pleased and excited when I saw stuff which I thought was great and would go places. And I was also impressed by diversity. I'm not much into faddism. You know, this is just a personal view from me. I'm just not much into faddism. Faddism tends to run through all of the creative areas as it does through other aspects of life, and it's a factor, it's a part of it. And sometimes you need to be aware of it, you need to be able to engage in it a bit. I think you need to know it for what it is. But sometimes it can just become, you know, everybody sort of was singing the same way, the same kind of song, doing the same sort of thing, with the same sort of accents and the same sort of moves. That doesn't really do a great deal for me. Now, I just wanted to talk about a couple of other elements of the business, and Rosemary's got here that the family's in the arts. That's true. I do have 3 daughters, and 3 of them are doing different sorts of things in the arts. That's never been something that you know, my wife and I have insisted that our children do. It was totally up to them to decide what they wanted to do. They're doing it, it's theirs. I don't propose to say anything about it except wish them luck, because they're obviously not going to make a great deal of money. That's fine. Finally, and here's the other thing I wanted to say. Sometimes I think the most important thing, particularly for directors and in theatre, is telling the story. That's really what it's about. And for me, telling the story is telling a story which shares something about how we are as humans when we're in extreme circumstances, or you know, if it's a comedy, when we're in ludicrous circumstances, and everything in between. But there's also a story for us to tell about our time, the time that we're in, things that are happening in this place, the place that we live in, the country that we live in as well as the world. And it's those stories that I think are particularly important. And let me give you an example of one of those stories. And I'm just not sure I should have Googled it on the way in, but I couldn't. I was running too late. His name may come back to me, and Pete, you or someone else here may know the name of this playwright, but there was a great play called Embers, which was written about the bushfires in Victoria, but not the last terrible ones, but the ones before that. And what the playwright had done is he had gone and got all the recordings of the two-way radio stuff between the bushfire volunteers and their headquarters, and then he'd taken the radio announcements that the ABC and the other radio stations had done, and then he'd taken the first-person accounts of people who saw this fire coming over the hill and suddenly realised that they were just going to get smashed, and it was all happening in front of their eyes. And this play was written. It had a very simple backdrop, just basically an Aussie bush backdrop. I can't remember all the details of it. And quite an imaginative use of some of this recorded material, archived, which is sort of on a slightly crackly radio over in one corner, and then the characters on the stage. You know, that play was I mean, the language that's being expressed in the play isn't, you know, superlative language. It's language that people just use day to day. It's what we might describe as our common vernacular. And the stories themselves, you knew what was going to happen, so it wasn't as though you were in for any big surprise. You know, there wasn't a big reveal moment, you know. But it was just compelling in the way in which it was done, because it was telling this story, and the actors really, I think, got into their roles. It was well directed, and it was fantastic. I wish it had done much better. That business is about someone knowing what are the component parts to make this thing work. And that comes to the question of the teamwork, the partnerships, the organisation skills, the bringing people together, the sublimation to some extent of ego for the product, if you like, or the piece of work that you're trying to deliver. Or supporting someone who's got the vision and who clearly knows what it is they want to do. And in the case of the director, that's why you have a director. Because ultimately, whatever happens, the director, if they're a good director, has to say, I know what I want out of this. I want to bring the best out of all of us to do it. This is my reading. Let's talk, let's share. Some will be more engaging than others. Everyone's got their own style. But at the end of the day, they've got to make the call. They must make the call. Okay, this is, at this particular point, this particular scene, when we fade to black, I don't want you to move a second. No nuance towards that audience, even though that's what you as an actor feel that you should be doing. I'm saying, let's just see whether that works. And then, of course, they make those decisions as they go. We used to mix our music and we used to mix our video representations as well. So we saw the thing through from birth to end. And I think that's important. I think you don't want to hand your stuff over to others, but you've got to learn how to do that. So we became a master of that trade. Now I know for directors who want to direct film, particularly in places like the States and likewise, they actually either have to develop a relationship with a scriptwriter, quite often they're partnerships, or they have to learn and develop their writing skills. For people who produce, they quite often have to develop relationships with directors as well. Relationships that are built on mutual trust, value adding, people bringing different skills to the table, and being, like mature about the way in which you really want to get this thing done, not wasting too much time in the process. I'm not someone for sitting around talking about what we're going to do. I like to do it, agreeing what the actions are, and then get on with it. And I think sometimes that will still take you a long time to get there, but you've generally got some energy underway which helps you deliver what it is you actually do want to do. Last but not least, this is a place where you will be happy. This is a place where whatever you're doing, whatever part of the role is, you will be happy. And the reason for that is that we are happy when we're involved in creativity of any kind. Professional, amateur, right across the range. There's heaps of medical research to prove it. I know all of this because I'm thinking about it from the perspective of kids in schools now. Because we've got an arts curriculum which we're bringing in, which I argue very strongly we should have. And I'm very excited about that, and I want it to be an alive learning experience for kids. But the fact is that you'll be happy, or you'll be challenged. You'll be really, you'll be kind of extending the fibres of your being, and your heart will beat harder, and your brain will tick over much more quickly. You'll be happy doing this sort of stuff, and that's very important as well. So I'm going to stop. Allow enough time for questions, and I hope I haven't gone on too long. Thank you. Short answers. Sir.
Hello, Peter. Thank you very much. I think you spoke so well, so beautifully, and I think you sound informed and inspirational, and thank you very much. Well, just for the record, I just, if you permit me, just a small correction.
Yes.
It's about the Beatles.
Oh,
yeah. Within 8 or 9 years, they released around 16 records worth of quality. 16? 16. All right.
And
it was virtually all number one, so thank you. That's all.
I'm going to accept the correction because your preface was so nice. I've got a feeling some of them only had about 9 3-minute songs on them.
They were all except for the Yellow Submarine album. All the rest of
all good. I'll have to file that. Yeah, that's right.
Thank you very much.
No worries.
Thanks very much. I thought it was very comprehensive. I don't understand why in Australia we seem to think if you're involved in arts, it's second range. Like, everyone tells you to get a real job. But we know, certainly we're now in the 21st century, and the need to consume, whether it's via YouTube, television, film, everything, we've got leisure time, and we want to, who do they think is producing that stuff? Without us, it wouldn't be there. But on a daily basis, we're seen as not useful members of society. And that is reflected in our politics. So what can we do to change that? And like you were saying before, we don't sing here and art. I think it's hard to reflect on all that. We're seen as a sports country. I don't think the sports people get, enough credit. But certainly as artists, get a real job. Do something useful.
Well, look, you can produce great work and ignore that. I value the artists, and all my colleagues do. I know that for a fact. And there are plenty of opportunities for recognition for people who do produce well. There are competitions, awards ceremonies, scholarships. You know, there's not enough, but there's plenty of stuff there, and I think just ignore it and produce good work. Yes, sir.
I didn't hear you mention this in any way, but what's your take on from the outside looking into perceived nepotism of the industry? Looking at television, for example, there's a lot of great stuff that doesn't quite make it, but then the stuff that does make it, you wonder how that got on. What's your take on that?
No, it's a good question. I'm not sure it's a function of nepotism, though.
Somewhat, isn't it?
Sorry?
Somewhat. It is through networking and...
Well, there's a... What's the line between networking and working with people that you've worked with before and nepotism? It's, you know, it's an interesting call. I think it's only... I would only see it as nepotism in those terms if someone clearly was doing something or producing something which they were not fully, you know, which they weren't fully gifted to do at all. Like the guy who's now, you know, the head of North Korea. You know, he clearly shouldn't be. It's an unarguable case. That was nepotism. But I do understand. It's a good question about television generally. Look, there's a thing about. You're right. I haven't spoken about the market a great deal here because it's quite an important discussion and it's quite a complex one. But at the end of the day, my view about it is simply this: government's got a role to play to ensure that we support and effectively provide the nurturing opportunities for people to do work. And government has a responsibility which they exercise through a requirement that there be locally produced work that people have the opportunity to see and hear. Outside of that, with television, for example, and television licenses, television companies, or producers or others, will make those decisions on the basis of trying to secure as many people to watch the program as they can. And so programs quite clearly are designed to that end. And some of them are unwatchable, for me as well. But that oughtn't to be a primary concern of the artist. The artist really is much more about how do I produce the work that makes sense to me. If they want to go and produce work to contract for that, then they can, that's their business.
Just to tap on the line, sorry guys. And in terms of ethnicity, the reality of Australia is one thing, and I know in a lot of your songs, which I love, you represent that somewhat. That doesn't seem to be represented on television either. It seems to be this imaginary world and this reality. You know, being ethnic, creative, you seem to be hamstrung somewhat within that.
Look, again, it's a good question. I think there's more representation across broadcast media of the cultural diversity of the country now than there has been in the past. Now, sometimes it's through comedy, sometimes it's cliched, but I wouldn't use, at this point in time, as it were, the measurement stick, what it is you're seeing, for example, on some broadcast media. I would, even though I think you're probably right, I would look right across everything that's being produced. And of course, you know, if I go to a high school in Western Suburbs, I know where you went to school. If I go to a high school in Western Suburbs, you know, I know it's going to be a really multicultural school generally, and a lot of the stuff that's they're going to be producing has got a strong ethnic sense to it, and it's fantastic. And it's only a matter of time before we're going to see it or before we're going to hear it. So, you know, you're in the midst of that journey. Maybe not as far as you'd like it to go. Sir.
Sorry. You're 25% of why I'm in Australia. That's true. That's not something. I'm running this theatre. How long am I going to run it? Like Australia.
Sorry?
In a country like Australia.
Yeah.
With no funding, with no nothing. Nobody's interested in culture. Nobody's interested in theatre. Those people are interested in theatre. Well, what can we do? And why did you leave what you did best?
Yeah.
Making us aware of things.
Why did I leave?
Leave where you told me stories which made me come to Australia. It's not only the midnight oil, it's not only the midnight sun, it's not only the Nullarbor, it's what Australia can stand for and what Australia stood for. All theatres in Sydney are demolished. They're gone. Where are they? Why are they gone? Why is nobody doing something? Why is Australia Council spending 72% of their budget on themselves, but not on the others?
Well, I'm
It's a bit extensive.
I'm not quite sure. I mean, I won't go into defence for the Australian Council at this point in time, because there's an arts minister that will make those appropriate comments. I thought, I mean, there's a review process with the Auscoast, you probably know. They've gone through a process, and I just can't. Miss Traynor and another gentleman looked at it quite closely, so we'll see where that ends up. But resources do flow through the Australian Council. Now, whether people receive funding or not depends on a range of other factors, as you know as well as I do. Sometimes the application is not successful, or other people might get the support, whatever it might be. On the bigger question, though, that you ask, I don't think it's a function of Australia. I think it's a function of where popular culture, economy and society is at this point in time. And that has always been the case, and I think it always will be the case. And for those forms of creativity, including theatre and what you do here, in order to reach a broader audience, there are obstacles in the way. I understand that. I understand that completely. Some of them probably could be removed, perhaps even by government. But if they're not being removed at the time, then you've only got one or two choices. As you've done here, you've persevered and you've provided that commitment, and you're nourishing another generation of creative people, so I applaud that. But I'm not under any illusions as to how hard it is. I don't agree with you, though, about sort of theatres disappearing or drama disappearing. Yes, there aren't the same theatres here in Sydney as there were 15 or 20 years ago, but there aren't the same venues either. You know, the live music scene is nothing like what it was even 15 years ago. You probably came a bit earlier than that, but when we were playing. Now that's, you know, at one level that's a function of regulation. It's a function of land use. It's a function of the priorities that we give for creative spaces. And there are creative spaces there for people, but they're, as you know, they're the subsidised creative spaces and the established theatres. So you won't hear me saying that I think that we've got it right here. I'm certainly not arguing that. What I am saying, though, is that for people who are in this industry and who are faced with whatever their current situation is, including some of those obstacles, there are ways of thinking about how you can manage, confront that and potentially overcome it. This lady.
I just want to ask, I think for most of us, we all have our regular day jobs, and you said to have a career because you get more per hour, which I like. But do you sometimes, and I don't know how many people I speak to, but sometimes when you're not doing something creative, you feel like you're banging your head against the wall just to finish so you can go to a rehearsal. So do you find, I don't know, because you have had such a change of pace and career, that you just think, oh, I just want to be doing something creative?
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Look, that's a really good question. That's a little bit about a left-hand, right-hand brain question too. I would like to have more time than I've really got to occasionally do, you know, I might pick up a guitar. I mean, I'm not much of a songwriter, but I might pick up a guitar on the weekends and do some stuff. And I do need access to some creativity to keep me alive and feeling good. But I also think that, I'm not sure how to best describe this, but I think the best way to describe it is that I'm very much focused on what it is I'm doing at the moment. And I like to think that if I give everything to that, you know, there's an element, if you like, almost of creativity in it. And it's not the kind of creativity perhaps that writing a song with a bunch of guys or going outside and, you know, sculpting or whatever would be. But it can be sustaining if I'm applying everything that I can to it at that point in time. However, yeah, of course I miss it. And so I love occasionally to hear a band, or I love occasionally to go to a bit of theatre or to a festival or something like that. If I can sneak in and have some of it, then I generally come back feeling like I've been nourished. Mate.
Yeah, just two things. You mentioned Embers. It was written by Campion Descent and directed by Melissa.
Descent.
Yeah, and directed by Melissa Stafford. Secondly, I was just asking because you obviously started quite young in the industry. What really motivated you just to keep going when obviously you got set back a couple of times or something, as most people do, and what really made you pursue and eventually become the band you were, and yeah.
Look, I think it was being with a good bunch of people. To do it on your own is really hard. I think for a lot of people, and for writers, maybe writer-directors and sometimes actors, I think, to have other people roughly working with you that definitely joined at the hip. You might not be having a great day, someone else sort of encourages you, come on, we'll get there. And that team thing that we had, and we were a team, and we were united effectively. And there was a cover on one of the music magazines many years ago now, but it said, united against the world. And that was kind of true. And I think that made it easy. But I think the other thing is, this comes back to the quality of the work. Because there have been people who produce great work and they've had no recognition in their lifetime. There are people who've been humiliated, ignored and rejected. There have been people who every time they send a manuscript it ended up in the waste paper basket, or now someone hit the delete button or the too-hard basket, whatever it was. And there are people, Emily Kangaroo started painting, the great Aboriginal painter, when she was 78. When she was 78, she started painting. And she started screen printing when she was probably 75 or 76. And she is the greatest artist, without exception, that this nation has produced. So, up there with Nolan and the whole crew, and well ahead of most of them. And she started when she was 78. And before then, she was a poor, disenfranchised Aboriginal woman living, southeast of Alice Springs, and living very hard. And so by the time she came to pour her guts out on canvas and the stories in the country, it really hit you with a force. So I think it's it's hard, but it's also, it's easy to lose sight of the fact that it's not easy. It's never going to be easy. One of the questions about being at the top for people is they've got no more ideas. And what I say to people, including to my own kids, is, when you're young, write it down. because this is when the ideas are flowing. And you're going to use that, for however long you go with it. Another thing to think about is that I come across quite a lot of people now, and I come across them as education minister, who are very involved in their community in amateur theatre or amateur music, and they're living very satisfying lives. It may not have been quite what they thought they'd be doing, but their creativity's flowing, and things are getting to a point which is fantastic, and they're loving that. And I know other people who, sit here for decades, just sort of really going at it, and then suddenly, you'll find something pops out for them, and for others who it seems like it won't. And sometimes there's not a lot of rhyme and reason in that. That's a little bit the way the shape of the world. Sometimes you're riding the wave, and sometimes it's breaking on you. So, thank you.
Everyone has an opinion on what you do. Do you have any advice on which opinions are worth listening to and which aren't?
That's quite an incisive question. So, the answer in short is I do have an opinion about this matter, and I only really take. Talking about creatively or in politics?
Creatively.
Okay. I only ever really took much notice of people whose instincts or creative judgments or whatever I really trusted. So maybe there's a reviewer, let's take it like someone who writes reviews, who I think pretty much gets it right. So if they wrote about us and I said, okay, but I would still read it. Most I would discount pretty much. And the same, I wouldn't discount people's views, but people's views wouldn't affect what we were doing. For example, when I said, I wanted to add this when I spoke about the audience, because there's layers in this, you see. When I spoke about the audience, what I meant to say was, but there comes a time, and it was the answer to the question about if you do get successful, where it actually isn't about the audience. and that's what I was really trying to say was, you want to provide the best possible opportunity for the audience to get into what it is you're doing, that piece of work. Having done that though, you want to be absolutely unabashed that what it is you're doing is what it is, and they can take it or leave it. Now you don't want cold air conditioning going down the back of their t-shirt while they're figuring out whether they do like you or don't. You want all that to be right, but once they've made their call on you, it's the same with critics. Once critics have made their call on you, then it's not that relevant. So I would test myself against people I trust, and quite often that's a family member or a friend, someone you went to school with, someone who doesn't really care. He says, or someone who I think in music, who ear I think is good, but I wouldn't get caught up in the critical response to something at all, because one of the histories of written assessment of the work that artists have done over the century, one of the assessments is that critics inevitably get it wrong.
Yes.
Sometimes they get it right, but inevitably they also sometimes get it wrong. So listen to the people you trust, no more, no less.
I just want to go back to earlier when you were talking about confidence and capability and all that.
Yep.
As an actor, I know my niche, I know what I'm good at and I know what I'm not.
Yeah.
What's your advice on, not trying to trap yourself in that niche and, challenging yourself and exploring it in other areas of theatre or singing, whatever it may be, and still trying to connect with people when you're still so uneasy about it? Like if you were doing a performance and someone then said, okay, you're going to do an opera song or something, that's obviously not your forte. How do you sort of push through that and still give a good performance and connect with people? And I'm sorry I sound like a man, I'm really sick.
My answer to that is charades. In short. And in order to prepare yourself to be good at charades, I mean, look at Hugh. Like he's a great dancer. He's learned to dance, and he dances really well. And he's probably shuffled around. I don't know, but he would have shuffled around in the kitchen and the parties, and done all that stuff. I had to learn how to sing better to the note. The only way I could learn was the same way that Yehudi Menuhin could play violin, was by doing the scales. Now, to be frank, doing the scales every day is pretty boring. But you've got to do it. But I think it's really just having a go. And having a go on the basis that if you know what your niche is, that's fabulous. But if there are other things that you're likely to get to, do a bit of work so you can, and go to someone else who works in that idiom, and they'll give you a hand. I think people are always willing to give advice, and I was always amazed when we toured and we met a range of wonderful musicians, and I met wonderful artists and performers and writers and everything like that. No one's ever been unwilling. If I asked them, look, by the way, how do you do that? How do you finish the story? Quite often it's a challenge for writers to finish ask a great writer how you finish the story, they'll tell you. And from artists, from visual artists, I learned a great deal about the business of creativity. Of course you find your niche. But, I mean, look at Picasso, he worked across sort of different idioms. It was very, not faddish, but was very kind of provoked and challenged by what was going on around him, but then just sort of went, oh wow, okay, I'm going to go off here. I'm going to use material now. Now I'm going to do, very fine sort of paint drawings. I picked a great artist, but the techniques are the same. You've got to try other things, maybe learn how to do them a bit better. I had to learn how to act a little bit when we first did video films. I've done a little bit of theatre when I was at school, but I'm not really an actor. I'm not saying I am now, but I had to figure out how to be at least convincing enough so that when this thing was on, when you look back on it, everyone wasn't going, try again. Work at it. I think it's just about time for a finish, so I'm happy to take any more questions quickly from anyone if there are some.
Time for one last question.
Actually, I was just wondering when you talked about doing singing practice, do you know how that compares to, say, just voice training, like you would do for the theatre?
They are different, but there's one thing, and I'm pretty sure this gets taught, but there's one thing that I think people miss out on a bit, and even teachers sometimes forget. Quite often, when singers are singing or when people are learning to project or to speak, they get a little tense and it starts to come from up here. And really, it's really more got to come from down there. So I think there's a great deal to be said for understanding and knowing how to breathe well. And I think that breathing well and the posture of breathing well is behind projection, whether it's an actor or whether it's a singer. And I also think it's pretty good for you. So if you learn how to do that stuff well, it's good for you. And importantly, if you're a journeyman, which we were, you know, like 6 nights a week, on, you don't lose your voice. And that's important as well. So, I mean, senior teachers and acting teachers will do this, and they do it well at the acting schools. I'm not sure that they emphasise this part as much as I think they should. One really good exercise for that is to imagine that you're chopping wood. So you stand with your feet apart and you're chopping wood. And then you chop the wood and you go down as hard and fast as you can. Put your hands on the floor. When you get down, so there'll be a sort of bit of air will go out of your body when you do it. When you get down on the floor, continue breathing out. Continue breathing out until there's basically nothing left at all. And then you just sort of pause, and sometimes you get a bit giddy because there's no more oxygen. And then when you breathe in, don't go like that, go all from here. So do it all from your gut, the solar plexus. And you'll feel, your body will feel the oxygen coming back in. It takes quite, you do it a few times to get it. And then when you come to say a line, instead of going like that, you go. But people like, you know, a Jeffrey Rush or a Kate, you know, are highly accomplished, great actors, of either, you know, they've just got the genetic kind of stuff to do it. They will have practiced and worked at it as well, but they just naturally do it. But for others, it's something you can learn. And I think that's very important. I actually think it's important for all the things that we do in the creative world, knowing how to breathe properly. I reckon that's something that people forget about. On that note, I'll shut my mouth.